Today we're going to talk about early plant diversification, some of the more primitive groups of plants, the non-vascular plants, and the vascular plants that are seedless. So early in the history of life on Earth, there were no plants on the land. There was nothing that lived on the land. All life was in the sea for about the first 2 billion years of life on Earth. And what land there was just lifeless rock. Cyanobacteria and fungi probably preceded the first plants onto land. Animals, of course, couldn't have been on land until there was something to eat, so that was after the first plants. The very first plants to emerge on land was only within the last 500 million years, so 500 million years after the Cambrian explosion that would have been. So plants today are almost 300,000 named species. And almost all of these plants are terrestrial. They live on land. There are a few species that have returned to live in aquatic habitats, like some seagrasses, but most of the plant-like things that live in the ocean are in fact algae. Some of them are green algae, which we'll talk a little bit about. Plants remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and also provide oxygen. In fact, land plants today provide most of the oxygen in the atmosphere, with photosynthesis that takes place in the ocean being the second most abundant source of the oxygen in the atmosphere. So if we look at a little tree here of the Archiplastida, so down here at the very bottom we have the primary plastid, so that makes this entire clade the Archiplastida, or the first eukaryotes that had chloroplasts. And so we have this weird group over here, glaucophytes and red algae, being early splits off of this lineage of Archiplastida, and then the green algae, which are the closest relatives to the plants, and charophytes, in fact, being a type of green algae that is, in fact, the closest to land plants. We would call the Archiplastida and also green algae paraphyletic, because remember, to be monophyletic, it would have to include all the descendants of the common ancestor here of the Archiplastida, and since land plants are excluded from that, that would make this not a monophyletic clade. And we'll talk specifically about what makes this the dividing line that we use. So how do we know which of the green algae are the closest relatives to plants today? Well, DNA has been the way to answer that. So there's 3 places we can find DNA in a plant or a green algae. One is in the nucleus, that's where the chromosomes are, but also the chloroplasts and the mitochondria, because they're both ancient endosymbionts. The chloroplasts resulted from the endosymbiosis of a cyanobacteria, mitochondria from an alpha proteobacteria. The first eukaryotes were cells that had endosymbiosis in alpha proteobacteria, and they have their own, so mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own little circular DNA chromosomes with not a huge number of genes, but dozens of genes. And we can compare the sequences of those, and that has determined that there's a specific groups in the charophytes that are most closely related to living plants. The zygnema and the coleochates. And this is a zygnema down here. So what are the adaptations that enabled the evolution of plants? Well, there is one adaptation that charophytes evolved that was used and needed for the later evolution of fully land plants. And that is this molecule, sporopollenin. Sporopollenin is considered one of the most important evolutionary innovations that led to the evolution of land plants. Sporopollenin is a complex molecule that it's almost plastic-like. It's water resistant. It's a polymer made from fatty acids and some amino acids. It's very resistant to degradation and enzymatic digestion, and it's waterproof. It helps make the spores of charophytes resistant to dehydration. So why would charophytes have this if they're aquatic green algae? Well, they live around the edges in shallow waters, and they get dried out seasonally. So charophytes evolved this molecule that helps their zygotes resist desiccation when they get dried out. And that was an important adaptation that allowed the evolution of the first plants from a certain group of charophytes. Moving on to land had advantages. There's brighter, more intense sunlight. The water filters the rays that are used for photosynthesis, so that was an advantage. CO2 is easier to get in the atmosphere versus in the water, and there were more nutrients in the soil that nobody was using. Being on land, though, had challenges. One is that things can dry out, and green algae is generally not resistant to drying out, so there had to be particular evolutionary innovations to resist drying out. And also structural support in the face of gravity, because in water is a buoyant support. In the atmosphere, however, plants had to develop rigidity to avoid, to not just be lying like a pile of mush on the ground like a jellyfish. And many species of plants emerged very quickly once these new adaptations appeared. So let's look at where we draw the line. There's three possible places that have been proposed to draw the line for the plant kingdom. So here's our Archiplastida, this whole group here. And some have proposed that we include everything with green chloroplasts, so the green algae, all the charophytes, and plants, and we call that kingdom the Verdiplantae, or the green plants. Others have proposed that we include the charophytes along with the plants, because charophytes, again, share that molecule, sporopollenin, that helps resist desiccation. But that is not the case today. Most people agree today, most scientists who study this agree today, that we're going to draw the line at embryophytes. And so we'll talk about what an embryophyte is, but plants and embryophyte, which are all embryophytes, share several derived characters that are not found in the charophytes, although they do share that one trait with charophytes, having that molecule around the outside of spores to help them resist desiccation. That is a trait they share with charophytes, but they have several other derived characters that are not found in the charophytes. So that is why plants are a separate kingdom today. So the derived characters of plants. So alternation of generation. These are things that are absent in the charophytes. Alternation of generation, having dependent embryos. So the diploid zygote that starts to divide and form an embryo. That individual, that embryo, is dependent for nutrition and protection on the parent plant. And that is not a characteristic of charophytes either. Walled spores, which is where we find sporopollenin as well, and also apical meristems. We'll talk about what those are. So alternation of generations is really important in studying plants. Remembering what meiosis means and haploid and diploid mean is also going to be really important. So if you're kind of hazy on that, if it's been a while since you read about meiosis and you're not sure what haploid and diploid and meiosis are, go back to that chapter and refresh your memory on meiosis and haploid and diploid, and all this will make a lot more sense then. So all plants have alternation of generation. So do some other algae. Not charophytes, though. Alternation of generations means there is a haploid individual and a diploid individual. Animals don't have this. In animals, the individual animal that you see is diploid, and the gametes are haploid. There's no haploid individuals. In plants, there is a haploid individual and there's a diploid individual. And we call the haploid individual the gametophyte, and we call the diploid individual the sporophyte. Gametophytes make gametes, Sporophytes make spores. So that's one way to remember it. So the haploid gametophyte produces gametes by mitosis because, of course, it's already haploid. It produces gametes. Gametes fuse, fertilization, and we get a diploid zygote, which forms a diploid sporophyte, which is going to produce haploid spores by meiosis. So we'll go into this in a little bit more detail. And we can see that here in this nice picture of this moss. The gametophyte, or the haploid individual, is the green plant that you see. The sporophyte is only this brown part here, and it's completely dependent on the gametophyte. So generally, this is what alternation of generations look like. So we have a diploid individual, and we have a haploid individual. The diploid individual, the sporophyte, produces spores. That's where meiosis occurs. The spores are haploid, but they're not gametes. These haploid spores are not gametes. They cannot undergo fertilization. They don't fuse with another gamete. They instead grow into a haploid individual, which is called the gametophyte. The gametophyte produces gametes by mitosis. Fertilization occurs, and now we have a diploid zygote. And remember that the zygote is that word that describes that cell that's a result of the fusion of gametes. When the zygote starts to divide, it's an embryo now. So the new little embryo grows into the sporophyte. So that's the alternation of generation. We have a haploid generation and a diploid generation, and they alternate. So, and plants are embryophytes because that little embryo that develops from the zygote is dependent on the parent plant. That's why they're called embryophytes. So the diploid embryo starts to grow within the female gametophyte, and this is true for all plants. Nutrients are transferred from the parent gametophyte to the embryo, and that's why we're drawing the line here. So all plants, all things that we call plants today, are embryophytes. Charophytes and the other green algae don't do this. Their embryos are independent. The zygote and the new little embryo that starts to grow is independent. It doesn't grow inside the female gametophyte like it does in plants. Here's one that is nice and visible. This is from the seed of a ginkgo tree. The species name is Ginkgo biloba, and it's a broken open ginkgo seed here. And you can see the nice little sporophyte, the little embryo that's going to grow into a ginkgo tree. Nice inside of there. You can even see a tiny little root starting to form. So here's a much more primitive plant. We're going to spend some time talking about liverworts and mosses because they're the most primitive plants that still have existing species alive today. And liverworts they might be the weirdest plants that still exist today. They're weird, but we can see this alternation of generations very easily in the liverwort. So this tissue here, this is a microscope slide, so it's a thin slice from a liverwort. And we can see this tissue here, that's the gametophyte tissue. Inside of this little sac here is where the egg was. The egg was fertilized by a sperm from a different plant, and a little embryo started to grow. So the embryo here is diploid, that's the sporophyte. This little embryo is the sporophyte, but it's completely dependent on the gametophyte. So the gametophyte tissue around it is giving it nutrition for a while. Eventually the sporophyte is going to enlarge much larger than this and then go through meiosis and produce haploid spores. So in a moss here, this is what it looks like. Again, this is a different moss. So the green part is a gametophyte. This stalk is a sporophyte. In mosses and in liverworts, the primitive plants, the sporophyte is never independent. It's never grows on its own. Generally, they don't photosynthesize. They grow out of the gametophyte, and they are totally dependent on the gametophyte. Meiosis occurs inside the sporangia, and that produces the haploid spores. And it is these spores, the haploid spores, that are produced that have thick walls that contain that molecule sporopollenin that resists desiccation. So these spores can resist harsh climatic conditions and also are preserved in the fossil record really well. This is a liverwort. Liverworts are weird plants. They don't really look very plant-like. If you see them, they are they don't have true leaves. They look kind of like green blobs with these weird structures coming out of them. These structures, this is on a female liverwort. So in liverworts and mosses, the gametophyte is dominant. That's the green plant that you see is gametophyte. So this green tissue up here that you see is gametophyte. This happens to be the female gametophyte. So each one of these little cups here has an egg inside of it. If it gets fertilized by a sperm, then the little embryo will grow and the sporophyte will grow. And this little brown thing here, a yellow thing, that is the sporophyte. That's as big as it gets. That's all it is. And meiosis occurs in here, and then haploid spores are released. The female structure where we find the egg is called the archigonia, and the male structure where the sperm are released from is called the antheridia. And in liverworts, there are male plants and female plants. So the female plants have these little umbrella structures that contain archigonia, and the male plants, they look kind of like little flat discs. The male plants have the antheridia. The sperm have flagella and swim and require water to get from the antheridia to the egg in the archigonia, which is why you tend to find liverworts and mosses in wetter environments. So here's a different species of liverwort, and here we can see the male gametophyte as well. It kind of they have these big green kind of leafy thallus-like structures that grow very close to the ground. The overall plant is still pretty small. If it's a male plant, then it produces these male gamete structures that contain the antheridia. If it's a female plant, then it produces these little umbrella kind of structures which contain the archigonia where the egg is. Now when it rains, there's water splashing around, raindrops hit the top here of the antheridia and sperm splash out. And if it's wet, they can actually swim up here into the archigonia. They just need a coating of water on things to swim in, and then they can fertilize the egg, and then our new little diploid sporophyte is going to grow right out of there. Another derived character of plants is apical meristems. Plants can continuously grow in one direction using apical meristems. Green algae just grow in every direction. All the cells divide and grow. But in plants, the root tips and the shoot tips is where you find most of the mitoses. And this is a derived character in plants. So the root apical meristem is not right at the tip. There's kind of a harder cuticle layer out here, and where we find the most mitotic cells is in here. And if you remember last semester when we looked at allium root tips in one of our labs, the place that we found the most mitotic cells wasn't right at the root tip, but a little bit in from the root tip. That's the apical meristem of the root. Now for the shoots that are above ground, the apical meristem is, again, where we find all of the mitotic activity and the most cells dividing. And in this case, it's going to be right at that growing tip. And these are under hormonal control, and we'll talk about plant hormones in a later chapter. This chapter is going to be divided into 2 videos. This is the end of the first video. In the second video, we'll talk about some more details of the non-vascular and vascular plants.